Hi, my name is Paul Jacobson. I'm WebTech Law's Director. I'd like to just talk a little bit about consent and the importance of consent in the context of a direct marketing campaign. As you can imagine, consent is a critical issue when it comes to your direct marketing campaign, because when you're marketing, after all, you're marketing to individuals whose personal information you're collecting, and you're obviously making use of that personal information to communicate whatever it is you're trying to communicate to those people. So the form of consent that you have becomes really important. If you're wondering why consent is important in the first place, we have written about this on WebTech Law, but the nutshell version of this is that in order to collect somebody's personal information, you're going to be required to have their consent first as a general rule. Obviously, there are, well, maybe not so obviously, but there are instances where you don't necessarily have to obtain separate consent. But if you want to be conservative about it and you want to make sure that you're covering all of your bases, then you really should obtain consent from these individuals, and they're known as data subjects in terms of the Protection of Personal Information Act, or as will be known when it's passed. So the consent that you have is really, the nature of that consent, or the quality of that consent, is really important. We talk about it as your consent model. So when you have a consent from a consumer or from an individual, the question is going to be whether that consent is specific, informed, voluntary, and whether it is an expression of will. And what a lot of that means is, it means firstly it needs to be specific. So it needs to be a consent to whatever it is you're going to be using their personal information for. It needs to be voluntary. So the person, and this also ties in with this idea of consent being an expression of will. So the person needs to, of their own accord, give you this permission to capture their personal information and make use of it. And the consent has to be informed, which means that you need to tell these people what you're going to do with their personal information. So not only what you're going to do with it, what personal information you're collecting, and under what circumstances you would disclose it. The way you do all of that is generally using a privacy policy which you need to have in place. Now, where this starts to become challenging is, as a direct marketer, what sorts of consents do you have for the individuals that are in your database and that you are marketing to? And this becomes a big problem for direct marketers who make use of databases which they've acquired from other sources. And the question you always have to ask your data supplier and yourself when you interrogate your database is, what sorts of consents do you have? Are those consents specific, informed, voluntary expressions of will? Do you have the data subjects in that database given specific consent to you using their personal information in the manner in which you want to use it? And what we see are happening often is the data suppliers will simply tell their customers, namely people like you and other direct marketers, that they have obtained opt-in. That doesn't really mean anything. Opt-in can be too general to be of any real use. So take a close look at those permissions. If you've acquired your data from a data supplier, and by the way, this is going to become problematic once POPI comes into play. If you've acquired your data from a data supplier, then you need to interrogate them and ask them more questions about the nature of their consent. Otherwise, you could be sitting with a database you just can't use under POPI. So pay careful attention to those consent models and make sure that you have the appropriate consents in place. And certainly from now going forward, have an adequate privacy policy in place and make sure that you are obtaining the appropriate and the correct consents given what you're trying to achieve with your databases and your campaigns.